Hi, my name is Duncan Wood. I'm the President and CEO of the Pacific Council on International Policy, a membership-based organization focused on international affairs with a heavy focus on the Pacific Rim. This has really been a historic year for Mexico. In the June 2nd elections, of course, we saw Claudia Sheinbaum, the candidate for the ruling Morena party, win an overwhelming majority in the popular vote, becoming the first woman president of Mexico. And that's historic in and of itself, that we have, finally a woman head of state, head of government in Mexico. But it's also historic because the levels of support that she got at 60% of the popular vote, a supermajority in the Chamber of Deputies, a supermajority in the Senate, more than a majority of the state level legislatures. We now have an unprecedented opportunity, at least in the democratic era, for a Mexican president to put in place and to execute an ambitious program in terms of legislation, in terms of executive actions, where she can really move the country in the direction that she thinks it should move. And that's important because, of course, Mexico faces a lot of challenges like many countries, but it also is on the brink of an enormous opportunity in terms of economic growth. There's no doubt that the Mexican private sector has not had an easy time with the ruling party, Morena, over the last 6 years, and in particular with the former president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO as we call him. AMLO adopted a program that was not business friendly. And in response, the Mexican private sector largely halted and stagnated their own investments in the Mexican economy. A lot of the investments that we saw were actually coming from overseas. Ultimately, as the business cycle progressed, Mexican businesses did begin to invest again, but they did so rather reluctantly because they saw that it was an unfriendly legislative and regulatory environment for them. However, with the change of president, although it's the same ruling party, there are a number of Mexican businesses and leading businesses and business associations that are now adopting a more pragmatic approach. They see this as an opportunity to work with the new government. They see that this is a government which is not necessarily as anti-business as its predecessor was. And in particular, they see an opportunity to influence the agenda moving forward. And so what I'm seeing is a lot more engagement on the part of the Mexican private sector. I think that they are, seeing, particularly in the early months of the presidency, an opportunity to push the government to adopt more business-friendly, more investor-friendly policies and attitudes. And I think it's beginning to bear fruit. From the perspective of foreign businesses, there's been a lot of anxiety about whether or not we'd see a radicalization of Mexico and the Mexican government, moving more to the left and moving more towards a nationalist, closed attitude. But there's one thing that we always have to remind ourselves about, which is that Mexico is part of the North American Economic Region. Mexico is part of the USMCA, and for Mexico, that relationship, in particular with the United States, is an existential relationship. If you were to lose that, or if you were to begin to see that breaking down, then the Mexican economy and the Mexican people would suffer dramatically. And in turn, of course, that would be a political disaster for the Mexican government. On at least a superficial level, you see that the economic program of Claudia Sheinbaum is a continuation of what Andrés Manuel López Obrador was doing. And certainly we saw that during the election campaign. We saw it in the sort of the election manifesto for Morena, that there was a lot about continuing the so-called fourth transformation of Mexico that AMLO had begun. Heavy focus on economic redistribution, on making sure that, for example, women's issues are taken care of, a new pension for women over the age of 60, real concern about the opportunities being offered to women in the economy, focus on healthcare and education, the kind of things that you would expect from a more left-leaning government. But really behind the scenes, I think what we're seeing is that there are a lot of folks who are now working in the government who understand the importance of working with the private sector. And we're seeing this across the board, with industrial associations, with chambers of commerce. For example, just a couple of days ago, there was a meeting of the energy industry in Mexico, and representatives of the government came along and talked about the importance of partnership and working with them. And we're not going to go back to the kind of halcyon days of the Peña Nieto government between 2012 and 2018, or the Felipe Calderón and Fox governments between 2000 and 2012. But it's at least, I think, an opening and a softening of the stance that we saw under López Obrador. And so what I see is that there is a recognition on the part of the Mexican government, of the Sheinbaum administration, that they really do need economic growth to maintain their legitimacy. And that means working with the private sector. Will they be willing to do whatever the private sector has to say to them? Absolutely not. I mean, this is ideology will continue to play a role. The perception of working in the interest of the people rather than the elites will be very, very important. But I do see, at least at this point in time, an opportunity for a coming together, what the Mexicans would call an acercamiento between the private sector and the government. So we've just had the US-Mexico CEO forum, leading businesses from both sides of the border coming together to talk about how they move the economic agenda forward. I would say the single most important thing that came out of that was the fact that the Mexican government, and in particular the Secretary of the Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, making, I would say, it's almost an impassioned plea to anybody who's listening, that Mexico matters, that Mexico is a good partner, that Mexico is doing the right things. If you look at the presentation that was made by the Mexican government to the CEO forum, you have an emphasis on the political issues of reducing poverty, improving opportunity for the poorer folks in Mexican society, but also a heavy focus on how the Mexican economy is moving forward, how much investment has come in over the last 6 years, what they're planning moving ahead, what is the relationship with Asia, for example, which is such a contentious issue right now in the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States. If President Sheinbaum was to give me a call today and say, Duncan, I need your advice, what should our priorities be? I'd come up with a relatively short list of things. One, getting the energy sector right is going to be very, very important. Reducing the costs of electricity production, making sure that there is enough clean energy in the system, and making sure, most importantly, that there is a reliable energy supply for business, for investors. That has to be an absolute priority. And the previous administration didn't do a good job with that. So that's a situation that needs to be fixed. Also on energy, on the oil and gas front, there's so much that can be done if only they will open themselves up to collaboration with the private sector. There are still investors out here in the United States, in Canada, and throughout the world that look at Mexico as an opportunity if only the regulatory framework was right. At the moment, there's a great deal of hesitation about investing in the energy sector because the correct signals haven't been sent. And I think this is a great opportunity. At the beginning of a new administration, this can be the right time to send those signals. Secondly, Mexico desperately needs to raise its taxation, its revenue. And the way to do that is to boost economic growth. So working with the private sector to say, what is it that you need to be able to increase your investments, increase your own profits, so that in turn you're paying more in taxes to the Mexican government. That's something which is a win-win for President Sheinbaum. She will get economic growth, which the private sector are going to love, and she'll also get greater tax revenue, which is essential if she's going to fulfill her priorities in terms of social programming. And I guess the last issue that I would point to is to say, work very, very closely with the United States. And that means, sitting down and having often difficult conversations about trade and investment disputes which are on the books. Let's try to get those resolved. It's fine for friends and partners to have disputes, but they need to be resolved quickly so that they don't really leave a nasty taste in the mouth. They don't damage the relationship long term. And I see that there's an easy way out of a lot of these disputes that are currently on the books between Mexico and the United States. It just requires the political will to do so. I think that we've already seen during the election campaign here in the United States that Mexico features Yes, there's the traditional issues of security, drugs, and migration, but really there's a deep concern here in the United States about the involvement of China in Mexico and whether Mexico is a reliable partner for the United States. And here are questions about, the judicial reform which was recently passed in Mexico. It's vitally important that Mexico responds to those concerns in a constructive rather than just a defensive way. We need to get Mexico to be on the same page as the United States. As I mentioned earlier on, people like Marcelo Ebrard, the Secretary of the Economy, have been making the case that Mexico is an essential partner for the United States. But it needs to be not just essential, but also a very positive and constructive partner. And so there need to be those difficult conversations. You need to sit down and you need to say, all right, how can we actually move the bilateral agenda forward? By doing so, I think you send a message not just to whoever wins the White House, but also to the US Congress, that Mexico, despite the issues that have been there for about 6 years, Mexico is really willing and able to come to an agreement and to work with the United States. And this matters for the United States at such a fundamental level. There's no way that the United States can compete with China without Mexico. The integrated manufacturing platform of North America is something which no other country has. And, it's one of the greatest strengths of the US economy. The US is competitive in large part because of the relationship with Mexico. And if that breaks down, that's bad for the US, it's bad for Mexico, and China's the big winner out of that. I think long-term Mexico is an incredible bet. You look at its profile, its demographic profile, its geography being, right next door to the United States and sharing a 2,000-mile long border. The fact that impressive investments have taken place in infrastructure. You've got a workforce which is relatively well trained and educated and ultimately trainable by the private sector. Mexico's a really good bet. The timing of the investment matters in terms of what's the bang for your buck that you're going to get in the exchange rate. But perhaps more importantly, or a lot more important than that, I would say, is really, are you going to get the certainty the legal certainty on your investment that you're looking for? And that's a question that the current Mexican administration really needs to answer. They need to provide those kinds of guarantees to foreign investors. If you can get the formula right, Mexico's a great bet to make. It has all the pieces there ready to work in favor of a better bottom line for businesses. We already have the strong cross-border relationships. And what I see is that Mexico has an incredibly bright future, if only it can seize the opportunity that's presented right now by nearshoring, by the strength of the US economy, and of course, by this geopolitical, geoeconomic realignment that we're seeing at the global level.